Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Spring, 1875. The train hissed and lurched as it came to a stop, sending a wave of dust across the platform. People bustled in every direction, travelers hurrying with carpet bags, telegram boys weaving through the crowd, and ranchers in trail-worn boots talking loud over the whistle of steam. Abigail Warren stood frozen in the middle of it all, her white wedding dress a stark contrast to the grit of the frontier station. The lace hem had turned gray with dust. Her hands trembled around the crumpled telegram that had shattered her future in 12 cold words. Marriage arrangement terminated. Do not come. Family circumstances changed. No signature. No explanation. Just a message delivered hours too late, arriving at her boarding house in Denver long after she'd boarded the westbound train to Cheyenne. She'd read it over and over, willing it to make sense. It never did. Now, standing on the edge of this wide foreign land, Abigail felt the truth settle into her chest like a weight too heavy to bear. She wasn't a bride. She wasn't anything at all, just a discarded woman in a foolish dress, with nowhere to go and too much pride to go back. "Miss, you all right?" a porter asked, glancing at her with a mix of concern and curiosity. She forced her shoulders straight, her Boston upbringing anchoring her to civility. "Yes, just gathering myself," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The porter nodded and moved on, leaving her alone with the stares. She could feel them, the sideways glances from women clutching parasols, the quiet whispers from men pretending not to notice. Abigail clutched the telegram tighter, as if holding the proof of betrayal would somehow make it easier to endure. She turned, looking for her trunk, her mind racing with impossible decisions. Where would she sleep tonight? Who could she telegraph? What respectable woman had ever returned home with her wedding dress still clean and unused? Before she could collect her thoughts, a shriek of laughter pierced the station. Two small girls darted through the crowd, identical in height and hair, both with copper curls flying behind them like banners in the wind. "Aurora! Adeline!" a deep male voice boomed, exasperation and worry tangled together. One of the girls barreled directly into Abigail, nearly knocking her off balance. "Oh," Abigail gasped, catching herself just in time. "Sorry, lady," the child giggled before scampering behind her skirt to hide from her pursuer. Seconds later, a man strode toward them, tall as the sky, and built like he could stop a stampede with his bare hands. His vest clung to broad shoulders, his brown hat shadowing a rugged, sun-darkened face. But it was his eyes, startling, sea-blue and searching, that stopped her breath. He grabbed the little girl's hand, gently but firmly, and turned his gaze to Abigail. Something flickered there. Apology first, then concern, then something else. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, voice low, laced with something cautious. "Hopeful, maybe." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. His eyes dropped to the telegram still clutched in her hand. When they rose again to meet hers, they held a startling clarity. He didn't look away when he spoke next. "You've been left at the altar," he said plainly. Abigail flinched as if struck. "That is hardly your concern, sir." "You're right," he said quickly. "I apologize. That was unkind. You just—" He hesitated, shifting the second twin to his other arm. "You look like someone trying to disappear, and I recognize that look." Abigail blinked at him, unsure what surprised her more, his honesty or how deeply it landed in her chest. "I'm Quinn Mackenzie," he said. "These are my daughters, Aurora and Adeline. Their mother died 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Abigail murmured, a reflex more than anything. She was still stuck on trying to disappear. "I run a cattle ranch 20 miles outside town," he continued, "and these girls, they need more than what I can give alone. I'm not looking for charity. she snapped, wounded pride flaring. He shook his head. This isn't charity. It's an offer. A job. A job. As a governess, he said. Room, board, a fair wage. You look like a woman who knows her letters, and they need someone steady. Abigail's mouth fell open. You don't even know me. I saw how you steadied her, he said, nodding toward Adeline, who now peeked shyly around his shoulder. You didn't flinch. Most folks would have scolded her. You didn't. That's hardly qualification. No, but it tells me something, he said gently. That you have kindness, and the look in your eyes tells me you've got nowhere to go. The words stung, but they weren't wrong. The last boarding call for Denver echoed across the platform. Abigail looked toward the train, then back at the man and his wild-haired daughters. Her life in Boston was a pile of ashes. Her pride, though still smoldering, could not pay for food or a roof. I have experience, she said quietly. Teaching. I worked at a school in Boston. Quinn's jaw relaxed. He nodded. Then you'll come? Her voice came slow, uncertain. 2 weeks. A trial. Fair enough, he said. The wagon's outside. We'd best move if we want to reach the ranch by sundown. Abigail glanced once more at the Denver train. Her old life was on that train. Or maybe it had left long before today. She turned away. Quinn took her trunk as if it weighed nothing. Abigail lifted her skirts and followed him towards something she didn't yet have words for. Outside, the Mackenzie wagon waited, a sturdy rig, hitched to 2 powerful horses. Quinn hoisted the girls into the back, where they immediately began playing with the folds of her wedding dress. Are you a princess? One of them asked. No, Abigail said softly. Just a lady who wore the wrong dress on the wrong day. Quinn helped her onto the front bench, his hand warm and solid. What's your name? He asked, climbing up beside her. Abigail. Abigail Warren. He nodded. Miss Warren, he said formally, then turned to the girls. Behave. Miss Warren is here to help. The road out of Cheyenne was rough, more path than street. The wagon bumped over ruts and rocks, the vast Wyoming landscape opening before them. Abigail's satin shoes peeked from beneath her skirts, entirely unsuited to frontier travel. Her back ached from the ride, and her head spun with the speed at which her life had changed. Yet something in her began to settle. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the way the twins leaned into each other and giggled. Maybe it was the silence from the man beside her, not demanding, not comforting, just there. Hours passed, and the sky softened to pink. There it is, Quinn said finally. Abigail looked out to see a ranch spread across the land like a promise. A log house, a windmill turning steady, a garden trying to bloom against the dirt. It's lovely, she said before she could stop herself. Quinn smiled for the first time. It's home. As they pulled into the yard, a stout woman stepped onto the porch, apron stained and eyes sharp. Quinn Mackenzie, she called. What on God's green earth have you done now? Quinn winced. Miss Warren, he said. Meet Mrs. Hodgson. She runs this place better than I do. The older woman's gaze swept over Abigail. Wedding dress, dusty shoes, wind-blown hair. A governess? She asked, disbelieving. It's complicated, Abigail said, lifting her chin. Mrs. Hodgson studied her a moment longer. Then she nodded. Aren't all the best stories? Inside, the house smelled of stew and wood smoke. The girls scrambled toward a worn quilt in the corner. Abigail followed Mrs. Hodgson to a small, tidy room with a narrow bed, a pitcher and bowl, and a single window facing west. Rest, the woman said, softening. You look like you've been through a storm. Alone at last, Abigail sat on the bed. She looked at the telegram again, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the drawer beside the washstand. She didn't cry. Not yet. There would be time for tears later if she needed them. For now, there were twin girls who believed she might be a princess, and a rancher who looked at her like a man surprised to hope again. She laid her head down as the last light faded beyond the horizon. And in the darkness, with the scent of prairie sage drifting through the window, a thought came as gentle as a whisper. What if this wasn't the end of her story? What if it was just the beginning? The Mackenzie Ranch rose from the land like it had grown there, built from the bones of trees and the will of men. The log house was large but weathered, with a wide front porch, a crooked fence, and a windmill that creaked steadily in the prairie wind. Fields stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by distant mountains like blue ghosts on the horizon. Abigail sat stiffly on the wagon bench beside Quinn as it rolled into the yard. Her back ached from the long ride, her once white dress now stiff with dust, and her thoughts were tangled like the wind-blown hair around her face. But it was the quiet that struck her most. So different from Boston's clamor. Here, silence lived in the space between hoofbeats and wind gusts, vast and unbothered. As Quinn helped the girls down, a plump, no-nonsense woman in a flour-dusted apron marched out from the house, hands planted on her hips. Her expression was thunderous. "Quinn Mackenzie, what have you brought home this time?" He winced slightly, setting Adeline on the ground. "Mrs. Hodgson, this is Miss Abigail Warren. She's agreed to help with the girls, as governess." Mrs. Hodgson's eyes swept over Abigail from bonnet to boots, lingering on the wedding dress now streaked with dirt and creased from travel. Her brow arched so high it nearly disappeared into her graying hairline. "In that get-up," she said. Abigail's cheeks flushed with heat, but she didn't drop her gaze. "It's a complicated situation. I assure you I'm qualified." The older woman studied her for a beat longer. Then something softened at the corners of her mouth. She gave a brisk nod. "Well, at least you've got spine. Come on in, girl. We'll see if you last longer than the last one." As Quinn took her trunk, Abigail followed the woman inside, ducking slightly as they passed through the doorway. The house smelled of hearth smoke, flour, and something stewing on the stove. The main room was both parlor and dining space, with a big stone fireplace at one end and rough-hewn furniture scattered throughout. A colorful quilt hung over the back of a rocking chair. The place was clean but lived in, cluttered with toys and boots and half-finished sewing. "Settle her in the east room," Mrs. Hodgson called over her shoulder. Quinn nodded and led Abigail down a short hallway. The room he opened was small but private, with a narrow bed dressed in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a trunk stand, and a single window looking west over open grassland. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it's yours." "It's more than I expected," she answered truthfully. He set down her trunk with surprising gentleness. "If you want some time before supper, you've got it. The girls are likely to pester you anyhow, but I can keep them busy." Abigail nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think I need a moment, yes." He hesitated in the doorway. "I know this is all sudden. Thank you for saying yes, even if it's only for 2 weeks. She offered a tired smile. "I didn't have many other offers. Today." Quinn left her alone then, the soft thud of his boots retreating down the hallway. When the door closed, Abigail finally let her shoulders drop. The room was quiet except for the creak of wood and the wind against the shutters. She sat on the bed and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. A stranger looked back, face pale, eyes shadowed, curls loose and wild from the wind. The wedding dress sagged around her, rumpled and out of place. She slipped off her gloves, laying them next to the embroidered handkerchief that had soaked up too many tears on the train. It still smelled faintly of lavender and shame. Folding it neatly, she tucked it under her pillow. Then she rose, unbuttoned the back of her dress, and stepped out of it. There was something deeply symbolic about letting the gown fall to the floor. She left it there, crumpled in the corner, and slipped into the plain blue dress she'd packed for traveling. Boston modest but practical. She washed up at the basin and pinned her hair back with slow, deliberate care. When she stepped out of the room, the house no longer felt quite so foreign. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hodgson was rolling out dough, and the scent of butter and flour mingled with meat stew. Aurora and Adeline sat on the floor nearby, playing with wooden animals and whispering conspiratorially. They looked up the moment Abigail entered. "Your dress isn't white anymore," Aurora said, pointing. "That was a special dress for a special day," Abigail replied, keeping her tone light. Adeline frowned, but it wasn't a happy day. Mrs. Hodgson turned slightly, her hands never pausing. "Girls, it's all right," Abigail said gently. "Not every special day goes the way we hope, but sometimes it brings us somewhere we need to be." That seemed to satisfy them. For now. They all sat down to supper at the big table. Beef stew, fresh bread, and a pot of sweet preserves. Quinn joined them last, still smelling of leather and dust, his hat in his hands. The meal passed with surprising ease. The girls peppered Abigail with questions between bites. "Can you tell stories?" Aurora asked, slurping stew. "Do you know how to bake pies?" Adeline added. "Can you braid hair?" "Yes," Abigail said between mouthfuls. "To all three." The girls beamed. Mrs. Hodgson gave an approving grunt. After supper, Abigail offered to help clear the dishes, but the housekeeper waved her away. "You'll earn your keep tomorrow," she said. "Tonight you rest." Later, Abigail stood out on the porch, arms folded as the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky blazed with orange and rose, the air cool and laced with wild sage. The twins ran barefoot in the grass, chasing lightning bugs. Quinn sat on the edge of the porch, carving something with his pocket knife. "They like you," he said without looking up. "I'm glad," Abigail replied. "You don't seem surprised." "I've taught children before. They know when someone means them no harm." He nodded, working the blade with slow care. "You don't talk much, Mr. Mackenzie." "I talk when I've got something to say." Abigail smiled, a small private thing. He glanced at her then, his expression unreadable. "What made you say yes?" She didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at her skirt. The twins were laughing, their voices carrying across the open land. "I didn't want to go back," she admitted finally. "Not to Boston, not after everything. You were going to marry a man you'd never met. We wrote letters for a year. He seemed kind, dependable. It was enough, or I thought it would be. He wasn't." "No," she said, voice tight. "He wasn't." They sat in silence a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken things. "You're not just here because you had nowhere else to go," Quinn said. "You're here because you want to be." Abigail looked at him. "I want to matter," she said quietly. "And I think maybe I can." He nodded. "You already do." Adeline ran up then, tugging on Abigail's hand. "Will you tell us a story at bedtime?" Abigail looked at her, at the child's messy braids and hopeful face. "I'd be honored," she said. Quinn stood, brushing wood shavings from his vest. As he passed her, he said softly, "You fit here better than you think." That night, in her small room, Abigail lay beneath the patchwork quilt and listened to the wind against the walls. The wedding dress still sat crumpled in the corner, a ghost of the life she'd left behind. But the quilt was warm. The house smelled like stew and children's laughter, and when she closed her eyes, she didn't feel quite so lost. Down the hall, she could hear Quinn's deep voice murmuring to the twins, followed by a round of giggles. Something swelled in her chest. Not sorrow this time, but something steadier, like belonging just beginning to take root. She turned onto her side, hand tucked under her cheek, and thought, if tomorrow was anything like today, maybe she wouldn't need to leave at all. By the second morning at Mackenzie Ranch, Abigail Warren rose before the sun, laced her borrowed boots, and pinned back her hair with practiced precision. The light from the eastern window cast soft gold across the quilt, illuminating the folded blue day dress she'd laid out the night before. She was ready to begin. Aurora and Adeline burst through the door without knocking, cheeks flushed, voices overlapping. "You said today we'd learn things. Will we have slates and chalk like real school? Will there be spelling bees?" Abigail folded her arms and fixed them with a look that was more amused than stern. "First lesson, young ladies. A knock is the polite way to ask permission to enter someone's room." Aurora blinked. "We live here." "And I do now too," Abigail said calmly, "which means privacy matters for everyone." Adeline glanced at her twin, then nodded solemnly. "We'll try to remember." Abigail smiled. "That's all I ask." Breakfast was hearty: biscuits, eggs, and thick slices of bacon courtesy of Mrs. Hodgson, who'd recovered from her headache and resumed her bustling command of the kitchen. Quinn sat at the table already, coffee steaming in one hand, his ledger open in the other. He looked up when Abigail entered, and something softened in his gaze. "You ready for the stampede?" he asked. "They're more eager than any students I've ever had," she replied. "That's a good place to start." "I'll be in the south pasture most of the morning," he said. "Holler if they tie you to a tree or vanish into the chicken coop." Abigail gave him a mock serious nod. "Noted." They started the day under the cottonwood tree behind the house. Abigail had gathered 2 small slates and chalk, donated by Mrs. Hodgson with a muttered comment about better use than gathering dust. She also brought books from her trunk, well-worn primers and a volume of fairy tales, and her own careful notes from her teaching days back east. She didn't sit them in stiff rows or start with endless recitation. Instead, she opened the day with a question. "What do you know about the world?" Aurora's hand shot up. "It's big," Adeline added, "and full of cows." Abigail smiled. True on both counts. They began with letters and numbers, tracing them in chalk and shouting out sounds. Then came spelling, using the items around them: sky, grass, barn, cow. The girls were bright but quick to wander, attention darting like birds in wind. So Abigail changed tactics. After lunch, she led them out to the garden, notebook in hand. "We'll study nature today," she declared. "That means learning the names of what grows here and how it grows." They squatted among the vegetables, identifying beets, carrots, and early shoots of beans. Abigail had them count rows, measure leaves, draw what they saw. Then they moved to the chicken coop, where Aurora tried to name every hen and Adeline insisted on measuring the largest egg. By the time they reached the creek, the girls were dusty and breathless. Abigail let them wade in up to their ankles while she sat on a flat rock and read aloud from their storybook. The sun warmed her shoulders, and the sound of water over stones reminded her how far she was from Boston, and how little she missed it. That evening, as the girls worked on drawing letters by firelight, Quinn stood leaning in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over his chest. "They're quiet," he murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "I didn't know that was possible." "It's not permanent," Abigail said with a chuckle. "But they're learning." "You're good at this," he said. "Real good. It helps when they're willing." He nodded, watching his daughters with something like reverence. They haven't had much structure since Martha passed. Just surviving. Abigail's smile faded a little. Now they're building something again. That matters. A beat passed before he spoke again. "You're building it with them." Her breath caught in her chest. She opened her mouth to reply, but a knock at the door interrupted. Quinn pushed away from the wall, frowning slightly. No one comes calling this late. He opened the door to reveal a man in his early 50s, dressed in Sunday best, hat in hand. His smile was practiced, but his eyes were sharp. "Evening, Quinn," the man said. Brought the wife over to drop off preserves. Figured I'd stay and meet the new governess. Abigail stood, smoothing her skirt. "This is Miss Warren," Quinn said. "Miss Warren, this is Reverend Talbot. He's pastor at the church a few miles east, lives nearby with his wife." "Miss Warren," the Reverend said, tipping his hat. "Word spreads quick around here." "Boston, is it?" "Yes, sir," she answered, her posture straightening. "A long way from home for a young lady." Abigail smiled politely. "Home is wherever you're needed, I suppose." Reverend Talbot studied her for a moment longer. "That's a fine way to put it." Then he glanced at Quinn. "The ladies' circle will want to meet her." Quinn's brow tightened. "They can wait." "No offense meant," the Reverend added quickly. "They're just curious. A woman arriving alone, it raises questions." Abigail's stomach twisted. She heard the implication clear as day, wrapped in polite tones and friendly smiles. "She's here as a teacher," Quinn said flatly. "That's all." The Reverend tipped his hat again, but the look he gave Abigail lingered. When the door closed, the warmth in the room dimmed a little. "I'm sorry," Quinn said. "You don't need to be," she replied, her chin lifting. "People will say what they say. My job is to prove them wrong." Later that night, when the girls were asleep and the house had quieted, Abigail sat alone on the porch, watching fireflies drift through the darkness. The cool breeze lifted the hem of her skirt, and her thoughts wandered. She knew what people whispered: governess, runaway bride, stranger. But none of that changed the way the girls lit up when she praised their work, or how Quinn's voice softened when he said her name. She could weather judgment. She'd done it before. What mattered now was whether she belonged. Behind her, the door creaked open. Quinn stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one and sat beside her, close but not too close. "They'll settle down," he said. "The town. They always bark when something's new." "I'm not worried," Abigail lied. "You should be," he said gently. "Not everyone here is kind." She sipped the tea, savoring its warmth. "I didn't come here expecting easy. I came to do something that mattered." He looked at her then, in the half-light. "You already are." They sat in silence, stars scattered thick across the sky. She thought of the slates and the storybooks, the giggling twins and the way Quinn watched his daughters like he was afraid they'd disappear. It was only her 3rd day on the ranch, and already her heart was beginning to root itself here. She didn't yet know how deep those roots would grow, or how the next test of trust would come not from strangers, but from someone much closer. The June morning was clear and warm, the kind of day when the prairie sky seemed too big for the world beneath it. Abigail walked between the twin girls as they carried small baskets toward the berry thickets near the creek. The air smelled of sweet grass and sunlight. Meadowlarks called from the fence posts, and dragonflies skated over the water. "Pick only the ripe ones," Abigail instructed, kneeling to show them. "Red like a sunset, not green." Aurora giggled. "Like your cheeks when Papa looks at you." Adeline shushed her, eyes dancing. "Stop. Miss Warren doesn't blush." But Abigail felt the heat rise anyway. "Focus on your berries," she said gently. "Mrs. Hodgson will need them for her pies." The girls scattered into the bushes, their laughter echoing. Abigail's own basket filled slowly. She found herself humming a tune from childhood, her hands working automatically. For the first time since arriving, she realized she wasn't thinking about Boston or the telegram. She was simply here. A sudden cry broke her reverie. "Miss Warren, it hurts!" She spun toward the sound. Adeline was clutching her arm, tears springing to her eyes. A swarm of yellow jackets rose from a hidden nest in the brambles, angry and buzzing. Abigail didn't hesitate. She waded into the thicket, scooping the child into her arms and moving back toward the creek. "You're all right," she murmured, her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart. You're safe." Aurora ran behind them, wide-eyed. "Is she dying?" "No, sweetheart," Abigail said. "Just a sting. Fetch the blanket and bring it here." By the time she reached the water's edge, Adeline's arm was red and swelling. Abigail dipped a corner of the blanket into the cold creek and wrapped it gently around the sting. "It's going to sting for a little while," she said softly, holding the child close. "But the cold water will help." Adeline's small body trembled against hers. "It hurts," she whispered. "I know," Abigail whispered back, "but you're very brave. Look at me." Adeline blinked up at her, lip trembling. Abigail smiled and brushed a tear from the girl's cheek. "There, like that. Deep breaths, in and out." Aurora crouched beside them, her own eyes wet. "She's braver than me." "You're both brave," Abigail said. "Now gather your things." "Where? Going back to the house?" They hadn't gone far when hoofbeats pounded down the trail. Quinn appeared on horseback, his face hardening when he saw Adeline's tears. "What happened?" he barked, dismounting before the horse had stopped moving. "Yellow jacket sting," Abigail explained. "It's swelling, but she's been very brave." Quinn knelt beside them, his big hand dwarfing Adeline's small arm as he inspected it. "You certainly have been," he said, kissing her forehead. "Let's get you home. Mrs. Hodgson's got a remedy for this." He lifted Adeline onto his horse, then swung Aurora up behind her. "Can you walk?" he asked Abigail. "I'll be fine," she said. "Go ahead. I'll be right behind you." Quinn nodded and rode off, the twins clutching him tightly. Abigail followed on foot, her heart still thudding, the scent of crushed grass and creek water clinging to her hands. By the time she reached the house, Mrs. Hodgson had already applied a poultice to Adeline's arm and settled both girls at the kitchen table with milk and cookies, an event rare enough to mock seriousness. Quinn stood by the stove, his hat in his hands. "You did right," he said quietly as Abigail entered. "Cooling it with water, getting her away from the nest. Exactly right." "I'm sorry it happened," she replied. "I should have been more careful." His gaze held hers. "Children get stung. You kept your head. That's more than most could manage." Something in his voice, warmth, respect, sent a flicker of heat through her chest. She nodded and turned to the girls, who were now calmer, Adeline leaning against her twin. Later, after supper, when the girls had been tucked into bed, a cry echoed down the hallway. Abigail was halfway to the door before she realized Quinn had already gone. She followed quietly to the twins' room. Adeline sat upright in bed, tears streaming down her face, calling for her mother in a trembling voice. Aurora hovered nearby, helpless. Quinn gathered Adeline into his arms, rocking her gently. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured. "Papa's here." But Adeline's eyes darted past him to the doorway where Abigail stood. The child reached out a small hand. "Miss Warren," she whispered. "Mama." Abigail froze. The word hung in the air like a prayer. Quinn's arms tightened slightly around his daughter, but he looked at Abigail, his expression a mixture of surprise and something deeper. Permission. Hope. Abigail crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, taking Adeline's outstretched hand. "I'm here," she said softly. The child clung to her, sobs slowing as she buried her face against Abigail's shoulder. Aurora climbed into Abigail's lap without asking, and Abigail automatically wrapped an arm around her too. Together, they rocked the children until both drifted back to sleep, Adeline still gripping Abigail's fingers. In the dim light, Quinn's eyes met hers. They were full of gratitude and something unspoken. Outside the room in the quiet hallway, he whispered, "Thank you. The nightmares have been worse since Martha. Tonight, I didn't think she'd calm." Abigail shook her head. "Grief takes time, especially for children." "She called you Mama," he said, his voice low. "I didn't tell her to," Abigail answered. I didn't expect it." "I know." They stood there a moment, the door cracked open behind them, the soft breathing of the girls filling the silence. Quinn reached for the wall, his big hand splayed as if he needed to steady himself. "You're good with them," he said finally. "Better than I dared hope." "Perhaps it was impulsive on both our parts," Abigail said with a small, shy smile. "But maybe it was also fortunate." Something flickered across his face. Something she wasn't ready to name. He gave a slow nod. "Maybe so." She retreated to her room then, heart beating faster than it had all day. She sat on the bed, staring at the crumpled wedding dress in the corner. It no longer looked like a symbol of humiliation. It looked like a relic of a past life already fading. Down the hall, Quinn lingered by the twins' door, listening to their even breathing, thinking about the woman who had walked off a train in a ruined dress and steadied not just his daughters, but his whole home. Neither of them knew it yet, but the moment had shifted something permanent. The trial period was no longer just a test. It was the beginning of a new kind of family. And beyond the quiet house, the prairie night held its breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The prairie glowed silver under the full moon. It hung low and bright in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard and turning the tall grass into a rippling ocean of white gold. The house was quiet behind them, the twins long asleep, the lanterns inside dimmed. A breeze rustled the cottonwoods and carried the scent of sage and something deeper. Earth, warm and alive. Abigail stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, the shawl over her shoulders not quite enough to keep out the chill. She didn't notice Quinn step out until she heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, voice low and rough. She shook her head without turning. "Too many thoughts, and the moon won't leave me alone." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, not touching, just present. "I used to write letters in my head on nights like this," she said after a while. "Back in Boston, when I couldn't sleep, I'd imagine what I would say if I had the nerve." "To who?" he asked. "My mother, mostly. Sometimes to myself, but mostly to him." She didn't need to say the name. He didn't ask. She took a slow breath. It was supposed to be a new start, a marriage arranged through letters, a promise of something. Steady. He was a banker's son, not overly charming but polite, reliable, and I needed that after everything. Quinn said nothing, only waited. "I saved every letter he wrote," she continued, pressed them between pages of a hymnal. "I believed his words, every one of them. He wrote of faith, of decency, of making a life together out west. He said he admired my education, my strength. He called me practical and rare." She let out a bitter laugh, soft and hollow. "I arrived in Cheyenne with my trunk, my books, my wedding dress, and a telegram waiting at the station. Just 8 words." Her voice tightened. "Change of heart. Don't come. Forgive me." She looked at Quinn then, her eyes clear despite the shimmer of tears. "I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, with everyone watching, a bride with no groom. The platform felt like a stage, and I was the punchline." He didn't look away. "That wasn't your shame to carry." "I know that now," she said. "But at the time it felt like it was all mine." She looked back out at the prairie. "I stayed at the hotel that night. The manager asked if I'd still need the bridal suite. I said yes, like a fool. Slept in the bed with my gloves still on." Quinn's hand curled into a loose fist at his side. "You're not a fool." Abigail tilted her head. "The next day, I sat in the station, holding that useless telegram. I almost boarded a train back east. I had enough for the fare. But I didn't." She turned to face him fully now. "Then you showed up, covered in trail dust, chasing those girls like the world might end if you lost them. And one of them ran straight into me like she'd known me forever." "She has a gift for that," he murmured. "I thought maybe I could disappear into the West," Abigail said, "but it turns out the West doesn't let you disappear. It makes you decide who you're going to be." Quinn nodded slowly. "What did you decide?" "I haven't yet," she admitted. "But I know I'm not the woman who waited by the window for someone else's idea of a happiness." They stood there for a long moment. The wind picked up again, tugging at the edges of her shawl. "I still have that letter," she said, quieter now. "The one I never sent. Not to him, just one I wrote for myself, to remember who I was, to bury it." Quinn looked at her then, really looked. "Would you read it to me?" She hesitated. "It's not for sympathy." "I wouldn't offer any," he said gently. "Just a place for it to rest." She searched his eyes for any trace of pity. There was none. Only steadiness. That was what struck her most about Quinn Mackenzie. Not his silence, but how solid it was. How safe. She went back inside and returned a moment later with a folded sheet of paper. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded. She sat on the steps, unfolded it carefully, and began to read. "Dear Abigail," she read aloud. "I know you feel ruined. I know your pride is in tatters and your hands are shaking and you can't see straight for the shame. But you are not broken. You are still you. You taught children to read. You nursed your father through his illness. You left everything familiar for a chance at love. That takes courage." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "One man's fear does not define your worth. One absence does not erase your presence, and one broken promise does not end your story." She paused, blinked back the tears, and finished, "Go west, not to run away, but to begin again." She folded the paper slowly and set it beside her. "I've read it maybe 100 times," she said, "until the words felt like someone else's. And then, finally, like they were mine." Quinn sat beside her, shoulders broad and still. "You don't need that letter anymore," he said quietly. "You lived it." She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He looked up at the moon. "You ever wonder if we all end up where we're meant to be, even if we take the long way?" She followed his gaze. "Sometimes, but only on nights like this." The wind quieted and the hush of the land wrapped around them. Abigail leaned back slightly, her hand brushing the porch rail. Quinn's knuckles rested just beside hers. They didn't touch, but they didn't move apart either. Inside, a floorboard creaked, and the faint murmur of a child stirred. Abigail rose. "I'll check on them." Quinn stood too. "I'll wait here." She paused at the doorway, hand on the frame. "Thank you for listening." "I'd listen again," he said simply. "Any time." She disappeared into the house, and Quinn stayed on the porch, looking out over the moonlit fields, the folded letter beside him like a relic finally laid to rest. What neither of them saw was the figure on horseback across the ridge, watching the ranch from a shadowed slope, silent and still, as if waiting for something or someone. Sunday morning brought a stillness over the Mackenzie ranch. The girls sat on the front steps in matching dresses, their hair braided tight and tied with pale yellow ribbons, their hands clasped around their little Bibles. Abigail had spent the morning gently guiding them through the story of David and the lion, then buttoning the back of their dresses and smoothing down their cowlicks. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary morning. But Abigail's heart felt anything but steady. Today marked exactly 2 weeks since she'd stepped off the train in Cheyenne in a dusty wedding dress, abandoned and humiliated. 2 weeks since a stranger with kind eyes and quiet strength had looked at her and said, "Please come with me." 2 weeks since she'd taken his children into her arms and, somewhere along the way, let her heart inch closer to belonging. Now she stood beside Quinn on the porch, the girls ready for the Sunday service, the ranch humming softly in the background. "You've brought them a long way," he said, watching the twins with a hint of awe. Both of them. They're different with you here." "They've done the work," she replied. "I just gave them rhythm." He shifted, his boots scuffing the porch. "You gave them more than that." She waited. There was something behind his words, something weighty. He cleared his throat, eyes on the horizon. "Your 2 weeks are up." "I know. You've more than held your own," he said. "The ranch, the girls, even Hodgson's warmed to you." "She made me lemon cake yesterday," Abigail said with a small smile. "I took it as a truce." Quinn let out a soft chuckle, then turned to face her fully. "I'd like you to stay, not just as the girls' teacher, as part of this home." Abigail's breath caught. "Quinn, that's a generous offer, but—" "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's a lot. I just couldn't let the day pass without saying it." She nodded, the wind teasing a strand of hair loose from her braid. "Thank you. Truly. It means more than I can say." They rode into town in silence, each lost in thought. Church was crowded, filled with the usual mix of ranchers, merchants, and wives in stiff bonnets. Abigail sat between Aurora and Adeline, their little hands finding hers. She felt stares prickle along her spine, some warm, others assessing. Reverend Talbot's sermon was on judgment and mercy. His gaze lingered on her more than once. After the service, the ladies' circle gathered on the church lawn, exchanging baskets of bread and jars of preserves. Mrs. Caldwell, president of the group, approached with a tight-lipped smile. "Miss Warren, a pleasure again," she said. "I trust you're settling in well at the Mackenzie place." "I am, thank you," Abigail said, keeping her voice measured. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the twins clinging to her skirts. "And how long do you intend to stay?" "I'm considering a more permanent position," Abigail replied. "Without a formal contract or a chaperone?" the woman asked, her tone still polite but lined with judgment. Quinn stepped forward then, calm and firm. "Miss Warren has been a blessing to my daughters. That's more than enough reason for her to be welcome." Mrs. Caldwell gave him a curt nod, then turned away. Abigail felt her cheeks burn, not with shame, but with anger. She wasn't here to cause scandal. She had followed decency, not fled from it. And yet, these whispers threatened to unravel all she'd built. That afternoon, she walked the edge of the pasture alone, letting the wind cool her temper. She picked wildflowers without realizing it, her hands full of bluebells and prairie clover. Quinn found her by the old fence line. "You left early from lunch." She glanced at him. "I needed air." He nodded. "They talk." "They do. I know it ain't fair. They don't see how good you are with the girls, how much steadier this house feels. They just see a woman without a ring." "I don't care about their opinions," Abigail said, but her voice wavered. Quinn looked at her. Really looked. "I want you to stay, Abigail. Not just for the girls. For me." Her heart thudded. "Quinn. Not a proposal," he added quickly. "Not yet. I wouldn't put that on you so fast. But if you're going to stay, I want you to stay knowing you're not just a hired hand." She hesitated. "And if I stay, what does that make me?" "Someone who chooses us, who makes this place hers." She swallowed hard, then looked toward the ranch house. The chimney smoked gently. The girls' voices rang faintly through the wind. Her heart twisted with longing. "I need time," she whispered. "You've got it," he said. That night she sat by the window of her room, writing a letter she didn't intend to send. Not to Boston, but to herself. "I'm not what they say I am. I'm not lost. I'm not desperate. I'm not a mistake. I'm a woman standing in a storm, choosing which way to lean. And I will not be bowed." She tucked the letter into her Bible, just beside the old one, the one she'd written in pain. This one, though, had no sorrow, only strength. As she blew out the lamp, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Hodgson, holding a folded piece of paper. Someone came by, left this. Abigail unfolded it. A name she hadn't seen in weeks stared back at her, the handwriting stiff and unmistakable. Jonathan Ellis, the man who left her at the station, the man who had now arrived in Cheyenne. The past was not done with her yet. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwoods, casting dancing shadows across the yard. Abigail sat in the grass with Aurora and Adeline, their little hands stained with blackberry juice, the hem of her dress marked with the memory of an impromptu pie-making lesson gone wrong. The girls laughed as they tried to wipe their fingers on her apron, then collapsed in a giggling heap against her. "You two are trouble," Abigail said, feigning sternness. "We learned from the best," Aurora replied, her eyes sparkling. Adeline, quieter as always, looked up suddenly, brows drawn. "Miss Abigail, can I ask you something?" Abigail brushed a curl from the child's cheek. "Of course." "Do you love our papa?" The question came like a stone in still water, simple and sudden and impossible to ignore. Abigail froze, her hands pausing mid-motion. Aurora chimed in, unaware of the depth of her sister's words. "'Cause Papa smiles more when you're around. And you smile at him too, even when you think no one sees." Abigail's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was too big for her mouth. It had been growing quietly, like roots beneath snow. And now, with one innocent question, the thaw had come. "I care about your father," she said finally, voice soft. "Very much." The girls exchanged a look and nodded, as if that answered something deep and settled. That night, the stars hung low and heavy above the prairie. Quinn had stayed behind after dinner to fix a loose hinge on the barn door. Abigail brought him a tin mug of coffee, walking barefoot across the porch with the kind of comfort that came from forgetting you were ever a guest. He was sitting on the barn's edge, lantern beside him, the glow catching in the folds of his shirt and the line of his jaw. "Evening," he said, looking up as she approached. "Long day?" she asked, handing him the mug. He accepted it with a quiet nod. Fences and chores don't care much about feelings. Abigail sat beside him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "But people do." He didn't speak right away, just sipped his coffee and watched the sky. The silence between them was familiar now, full of understanding rather than discomfort. "I heard the girls asked you something today," he said finally, voice low. Abigail smiled, looking down at her hands. They have a way of getting to the heart of things. "They do." She looked over at him. "Did they ask you too?" "No, but I figured they would." She hesitated, then asked, "What would you have said?" Quinn set his mug down, turned slightly toward her. His eyes met hers, steady, warm, and entirely without pretense. "I'd have said yes," he answered. "I do." The world went still around her. The barn, the fields, the quiet wind, everything held its breath. "You don't need to say anything," he added quickly. "I know you're still finding your footing. I just needed you to know. I've been a widower long enough to understand not to push." Abigail's heart beat in her throat. "You've shown me more grace than I ever thought I deserved," he said. "You've made this house a home again. You've given those girls something I never could on my own." His voice caught slightly. "And if you stay, Abigail, you'll never be alone again." She looked at him then, not just at his face, but at everything he was. The man who let silence speak when words would only bruise. The man who'd taken in a stranger on a train platform and trusted her with his daughters. The man who had never once asked her to be anyone but herself. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and laid her hand gently in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and sure. They sat that way for a long time under the stars, neither needing more than that simple connection. But in the distance, beyond the glow of lanterns and the hush of open fields, trouble was moving. Jonathan Ellis, the man who had left Abigail behind, was asking questions in Cheyenne, and he had no intention of leaving quietly. The air smelled of cottonwood and wild mint as Quinn led Abigail along the familiar trail, the late spring grass brushing against their boots. Overhead, the moon was rising full and round, casting a soft light over the land. The girls had gone ahead with Mrs. Hodgson, baskets full of bread and berries for the picnic. It was the same spot by the creek where they'd first gone as a makeshift family, where Adeline had fallen in and Abigail had laughed for the first time since arriving. Now the creek murmured gently beside them, the same as it had weeks before, though everything else had changed. "You remember this place?" Quinn asked. "How could I forget?" Abigail smiled, looking around. The clearing was wrapped in silver light, the water glinting like glass. "This is where your daughters tried to teach me how to skip stones and ended up soaking wet. And you didn't run off that day," he said, more to himself than her. She turned to face him. "I wasn't planning to stay then. I didn't think I had a place here." "You do," he said quietly. "You always did. I just had to wait for you to see it." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn at the edges. Abigail's breath caught as he opened it and drew out a gold ring. Simple, delicate, with a blue stone at the center. "This was my mother's," he said. "She wore it until the day she died. Told me to save it for the woman who could carry this land in her hands and still make a home out of it." Abigail stared at the ring, unable to move. "I know we didn't come together the way stories say we should," he said, stepping closer. "But I also know what I've seen. I've seen you bring laughter back into my girls' lives. I've seen you stand firm when others questioned you. I've seen you take sorrow and turn it into something steady." His voice deepened, roughened. "You are the mother they've longed for, and the woman I never dared hope for again." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't the bride she'd once imagined. She wore no white lace now, only a faded calico dress and a heart that had been torn and sewn back together. But she was seen, fully, deeply, and chosen. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The breath Quinn let out was almost a laugh, relief and joy wrapped together. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had waited for her all along. From the trees came a cheer, high-pitched and triumphant. "Papa did it," Aurora shouted, running toward them. "He really did it." Adeline followed close behind. Abigail laughed as the girls flung themselves into her arms. Quinn crouched beside them, wrapping all three in a solid embrace. It was messy and warm and perfect. The next morning, news spread through the town like wildfire. The school teacher from Boston and the quiet widower from Mackenzie Ranch were to be married. Most folks received it with grins and nods. There had been whispers, sure, but no one could deny the change in the girls or the steadiness Quinn had found. Even the ladies' circle, long quick to judge, found themselves cornered by the tide of goodwill. Mrs. Caldwell said nothing publicly, but she brought a pie to the ranch the next week. That was answer enough. Abigail stood on the porch at dusk, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The ring on her hand glowed faintly in the light. Quinn joined her, wordless as always, slipping his arm around her waist. For a moment, the world was still, but stillness is not the same as peace. Because in the growing dark, just beyond the town, Jonathan Ellis handed a sheriff a folded piece of paper, a warrant. And on that paper was Quinn Mackenzie's name. The wind swept gentle and golden across the Mackenzie fields, teasing the edge of a white cotton tablecloth pinned over a quilt that had seen 3 generations of sunrises. It was the first week of October, and Wyoming was dressed in her finest, amber grass, crisp blue skies, and wildflowers clinging stubbornly to the edge of autumn. The wedding wasn't grand. There were no carriages or satin ribbons, no organ music or lace-trimmed veils, but it was the kind of wedding that etched itself into memory, honest, rooted, and utterly right. They set up the ceremony near the old oak at the ridge behind the ranch house. Quinn had built a simple arch from aspen branches, tied together with twine and decorated with sprigs of prairie sage and blue cornflowers. Abigail's bouquet was made by Aurora and Adeline, half wild, half lopsided, but radiant with love. The whole community came. Tom Weaver brought benches from the church. Old Mrs. Jensen baked 6 pies. Reverend Talbot offered his Bible and his best coat. Even the stable hands from 3 ranches over sent fresh-cut hay to line the path. The ladies' circle, silent since the engagement, arrived in full force, hats trimmed with feathers, baskets swinging with casseroles and cornbread. Their silence had transformed into support, as it often did when a town decided something was worth rooting for. Abigail wore a new dress, sky blue like spring rain, sewn by Mrs. Hodgson and finished with lace edging saved from the widow's own trousseau. Her hair was pinned simply, her hands shaking only slightly as she held the bouquet. Quinn stood at the altar in his cleanest vest and the familiar brown hat that had weathered wind and years. He hadn't shaved. Abigail had said she liked the rough stubble, and so he kept it. When she walked toward him, Adeline and Aurora on either side, barefoot and laughing in their matching dresses, Quinn's jaw clenched in the way it always did when emotions threatened to spill. "You're a vision," he whispered as she reached him. "You're late to say that," she teased, her voice barely above a breath. Reverend Talbot kept it short and true. No sermons, no pomp. Just 2 people, their hands clasped beneath the sky, surrounded by those who mattered. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Quinn bent to kiss her, slow and sure, with both hands cradling her cheeks as if she were made of the very breath he lived on. Cheers erupted. Aurora whooped. Adeline threw her arms around their waists. Someone struck up a fiddle, and soon the meadow echoed with music, stomping boots and the scent of hot pie cooling on blankets. Mrs. Hodgson wept openly. "She's one of us now," she murmured, dabbing at her eyes. "That girl came off the train with nothing but a torn dress and quiet pride, and look at her now." As the celebration carried into the orange-streaked afternoon, Quinn pulled Abigail aside. "I've got something to show you." He led her down a winding trail, hand in hand, past the creek where he'd proposed, through a grove of birch trees dusted in golden leaves. Nestled in the clearing beyond was a small cabin, newly built, still smelling of pine and sawdust. She stared in awe. "It's not much yet," he said, "but it's ours, a space to begin again, just the 4 of us." Inside, the walls were lined with shelves waiting for books and dishes. A quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed. One window faced east to catch the morning light, the other west to hold on to the last of the day. She walked the room in silence, her fingers trailing along the frame of the doorway, the edge of the windowsill, the small table in the corner carved with a heart barely visible. When she turned back to him, her eyes were full. "I thought I'd lost everything," she whispered. "You found more," he said, "and built it with your own 2 hands." They stood there in the golden hush of evening, 2 people who had lost and grieved, fought and waited, and had finally chosen to stay. But just as the sun dipped low and the cabin filled with the soft hush of possibility, a sharp knock echoed from the ranch gate in the distance. Sheriff Donnelly's silhouette stood tall in the dying light, hat in hand, a folded paper clutched tight. "Evening, Quinn," he called out. "I'm afraid we've got a matter to discuss. It's official business." Abigail felt her husband's hand tighten around hers. The past, it seemed, had not given up its chase. The leaves drifted gently through the air, orange and gold against a sky so blue it looked brushed on. Autumn had come again to the Mackenzie Ranch, clean, cool, and full of promise. The fields were quiet except for the low rustle of grass and the sound of a windmill creaking somewhere near the barn. Abigail walked slowly down the path, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other clasping Adeline's. Aurora skipped just ahead, humming a tune she'd made up on the spot. The girls had grown taller, but still had the same wild curls and curious hearts. They were no longer the quiet, careful children of 2 years ago. They had become something freer, something whole. "I think it's a girl," Adeline said with conviction, peering up at Abigail's stomach. Aurora stopped and turned around. "No way. Papa says it's going to be a boy. Big hands like his." "Maybe both of you are wrong," Abigail teased. "Maybe it's 2. The girls shrieked and laughed, racing ahead again. She watched them with a full heart. Every step she took along that dirt path had once felt uncertain, but now it was home. The ache of the past was still part of her, but it didn't define her anymore. It was just one chapter in a story that had become rich and real. They found Quinn near the fence line, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. He looked up and smiled as they approached, the kind of smile that started in his eyes and spread slowly, surely. "You're early," he said, setting down his tools. "Or you're late," Abigail replied, arching an eyebrow. He leaned down to kiss her cheek, then lifted both girls up in his arms, one on each side like he always did, even though they were heavier now. "Your daughters have strong opinions about this baby," Abigail said. "I'd be shocked if they didn't," Quinn chuckled. "They have your stubborn streak." She gave him a mock glare. "I think you mean your stubborn streak." They sat together on the edge of the old hay cart, now turned into a bench. A picnic was packed, apple slices, smoked cheese, warm bread wrapped in linen. The sky stretched wide above them, just as it had the day Quinn first asked her to stay. "Did you ever think," she said, breaking a piece of bread, "we'd come this far?" Quinn looked at her, thoughtful. "I didn't think I'd get the chance to. Not again. Not after—" He trailed off, glancing at the girls who were now playing a quiet game nearby, stacking stones. "But then you stepped off that train," he said, dusty, scared, proud as hell. Abigail smiled, remembering. "And you offered me a job I wasn't sure I wanted." "You didn't just take care of them," he said, his voice quieter. "You gave them back their joy, their laughter, their sleep. You gave them a mother." He turned toward her fully now, one hand warm against her back. "Thank you for coming with me," he said. "Our twins finally have the mother they prayed for." Her throat tightened, eyes shimmering. "And I have the family I never thought I'd earn." The sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting golden light across the fields. Abigail laid her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sawdust and earth and home. "What do you think?" he asked. "Martha, if it's a girl. And Daniel, if it's a boy," she said. "After my mother and your brother." She nodded, fingers lacing through his. Quinn kissed the top of her head. Strong names, for a strong beginning. They stayed like that until the light faded, until the stars returned to the sky, and the wind carried the scent of the harvest down from the hills. In the quiet of that evening, their story didn't end. It rooted deeper, into the land, into each other, into the legacy they were building, one honest day at a time. And though the past had tried to claim them, love had outlasted it all. This was just the beginning. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and love that grows like wheat in good soil, subscribe to Western Legacy now. More tales of cowboys, courage, and the women who changed their lives are coming soon. This land has more stories to tell, and we'll be right here, waiting to share them with you.